We're going to continue today with the story of Nebuchadnezzar's liberation from pride. And for those of you who were not here last week, we learned that God opposes pride. And it's not because God has a big ego. It's because pride is anti-community. And pride is anti-servanthood, and pride is anti-love. We learn that God is the most humble being in the world, that the Trinity is really the ultimate expression of humility and of servanthood and of submission. And because we're invited to be a part of that community, we said that as a church, we want to declare war on pride. We said we would acknowledge our dependence on God each day throughout this week. We would have a Daniel kind of conversation with a friend and address our blind spots in the area of pride. We would let God interrupt us at times with what Bonhoeffer calls the ministry of interruptions. And we said that we would be kind to those Jesus calls the least of these. And I don't know how it went for you, but for Nebuchadnezzar, he has a really hard time with this issue. Last week we saw that God tried one approach with Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't do so well. So God has to go to plan B. And I want to talk today about these two approaches that God takes, because he not only takes these with Nebuchadnezzar, but he takes these approaches with people like you and me as well. These approaches are very real, and it makes a huge difference which one we respond to. In the first plan, which we saw last week, God seeks to reason with Nebuchadnezzar. And this is always God's first plan. I think of one of the great statements in Scripture. It's in the book of Isaiah, where God's people are being stubborn and unruly and defiant, and God says to his people, "Come, let us reason together." It's an amazing statement because God doesn't have to do this. He doesn't have to reason with stubborn, fallen people. He could impose his will. He could have his way, but he pays us an amazing compliment by treating us as human beings and honoring our freedom. He appeals to our minds and our wills. He desires that we would choose to do good with an open spirit. Ron Wallace, an Old Testament scholar who writes on Daniel, says this approach, which God takes with Nebuchadnezzar here at first, is like the parable of the sower and the seed. Jesus tells a parable, a story, about a sower sowing seed. And he says that the seed is God's words. It's God's word, it's his words, it's his thoughts. And the sower takes this seed and he just scatters it everywhere. But it really depends on the soil, on the condition of our hearts, what will actually happen. Where our hearts are soft and open and uncluttered, where the soil goes deep, then the seed will take root and it will bear fruit and there will be amazing growth. And where the soil is shallow or hard or resistant or real cluttered, the seed doesn't do much at all. It doesn't have much of a chance. When the soil is hard, when your heart and my heart is hard, it closes itself off from God's gentle offer to reason together. Now, that's what happens in this story with Nebuchadnezzar. God is very clear about what Nebuchadnezzar needs to learn and to do. Look at Daniel 4:17. The dream first comes to Nebuchadnezzar, and the dream is recited. Then verse 17, the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. Now, in case Nebuchadnezzar should miss that message, it's repeated again. Look at verse 25. This is from Daniel now giving the interpretation of the dream. He says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes." Now, just in case Nebuchadnezzar is still unclear about it, look at verse 32. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. God is not subtle or obscure about this lesson with Nebuchadnezzar. This is like an open book test. Like Nebuchadnezzar knows what the final is going to be. God gives him this dream, and it's very vivid. And furthermore, God gives him Daniel, a wise spiritual friend, to explain the dream. And in verse 27, you remember from last week, at the end of his explanation, Daniel says, "Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed." And then look at the last sentence in verse 27. "It may be that then your prosperity will continue." It may be. It depends. It kind of hangs on whether or not the soil, Nebuchadnezzar's heart, is open and receptive and responsive to the seed, to God's words, to God reasoning with him. If he will receive this seed, let it take root and bear fruit and become a student in the school of humility, it may be that things will go well for him. All right, let's read on and see what happens. Verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" How's he doing in the area of humility? Like, is he growing as a humble guy? How many of you know who Joe Namath is? You know who John Namath is? He's this hotshot Hall of Fame quarterback who wrote an autobiography back in 1970. Do you know what the autobiography is titled? It's kind of a funny title. It's called, "I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day." One of Muhammad Ali's famous quotes is, "I am the greatest." That's the school Nebuchadnezzar went to. And God plants this seed, and then God waits to see if it will bear fruit. Look at verse 29. How long does God wait? 12 months. God gives Nebuchadnezzar a whole year. He's so patient. Every day, Nebuchadnezzar wakes up for a year. Every day, he chooses to kind of push this dream and its meaning out of his mind. Every day, he says, "I will not bend the knee to this God. I will not do justice as he asks. I will not show kindness to the poor and the oppressed. Not today. I'll build my gardens and my palaces and my walls. I'll spend my money the way I want to spend my money." Maybe he thinks God's bluffing. Like maybe he thinks he's clever enough to outsmart God. Maybe he tells himself that one day he'll pay attention. One day he'll give his obedience to God, but not today. He tries hard not to think about the dream at all. And I'll bet he avoids Daniel for that entire year. Until 1 year later, the seed that God sowed in him is so dead that he's become a complete slave to the arrogance and self-centeredness that God so strongly cautioned him against. And he gives it free rein in his life. He's unchecked in his spirit now. Therefore, God is going to have to go to plan B. And plan B is going to be much more painful for Nebuchadnezzar. For if people refuse to listen to God without pain, he will use pain if he has to. It's never his first choice, but he will use it, and it really depends on the person. Nebuchadnezzar's not the only example of this either. This is quite a clear pattern in Scripture. There's a story in the Bible about Jonah. God plants a seed. God reasons with him. He gives him a word. He says, "Go to Nineveh and proclaim the news that the people ought to repent there." And Jonah resists. He hardens his heart, and he gets on a boat, and he goes the opposite direction. And so God goes to plan B. Do you remember what it is? He sends a storm, and Jonah is thrown overboard, and he's swallowed by a large fish. Now, it's a very effective attention-getting device. If you get swallowed by a large fish, it's going to get your attention. That's plan B. I think of Pharaoh. You know, when you stop to think about it, it's really quite amazing. God sends Moses to reason with Pharaoh. to give him words, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to do it. And so eventually, God sends plan B. And if you know the story, you know plan B involves things like gnats and frogs and flies and grasshoppers and all this stuff, essentially the Midwest in the middle of the summer. And Pharaoh never did submit to God right to the very end. He resisted right to the very end. And I just want to pause here for a moment because God may be trying to sow some seed in some of the hearts in this room. God's been saying, come, let us reason together. He does this in a gentle way. Maybe it looks like something like this. I read about a politician who was making an idol of his work, and his heart was shriveling up, and he called his son one night, and he said, I'm not going to be home to tuck you in tonight. And this is the 5th night in a row that he wasn't going to be home and miss bedtime, and his son said, well, wake me up when you get home. And the dad said, no, I can't do that. It'll be too late. And his son said, wake me up no matter what time it is because I just want to know you're here. I just want to know you're home. And the father writes, to this day, I can't precisely explain what happened to me at that moment, but suddenly I knew I had to leave my job. It was just a word. God has been speaking to some of you through maybe an uneasy conscience, and you've been ignoring it. Some of you, a friend has tried to tell you about a concern they have for you, like Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar, and you're just blowing it off. For some of you, there's some area in your life where you're not letting God be God. You're not saying, your kingdom come, your will be done. Maybe it's a pattern of deceit in your life. Maybe it involves sexual misbehavior. Maybe it's a lack of concern for the poor. Occasionally you come to church and you hear a message about this and you know you ought to come clean. You know that you ought to get help. You ought to turn around. You know that you're defying God. And you've been doing this now for day after day and week after week and month after month, and you find that if you can just get distracted, if you can just allow your life to get so cluttered that feeling or that uneasiness will go away. And so I just want to tell you right now, when God wants to reason with you, when God comes in that gentle, still, small voice, don't ignore it. It's foolishness to ignore God. It really is. And maybe you think God's bluffing. He's not. Maybe you've been saying to yourself, someday I'll get around to giving God my obedience. Listen to what Psalm 32:8 says about these two approaches. God says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. That's plan A. I'll reason with you. I'll give you the word. And then he goes on to say, do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by bit and bridle, by pressure and by pain. That's plan B. Don't be that way, God says. You don't want to do that. I don't want to treat you like that, God says. But people do all the time. And I'm just concerned because I think God may be saying to some of you, come, let us reason together. Let me sow a seed in your heart. And you've been saying no. And you need to stop saying no. You need to listen to him and you need to respond to him. Well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't. And God is so humble. Through this dream and through Daniel, he says to Nebuchadnezzar, come, let's reason together. And Nebuchadnezzar says, no, not today, not me. And so God goes to plan B. And plan B involves much more drastic measures. This is going to hurt. He sends Nebuchadnezzar on an involuntary sabbatical. He's going to lose his throne and his wealth and his community and even his sanity. God will have to use some pressure and some molding to reshape Nebuchadnezzar's character. Now, the image here is an image of a potter who's working with some clay. And I just want to make this real visible for all of us today. So we're going to watch a video, and then I'm going to read a passage in Jeremiah. So watch this video. Jeremiah 18 is a classic passage about this picture. It was actually written precisely in Daniel's day. Israel had been disobedient. They had refused to reason together with God, and their exile was part of the way that God was going to have to deal with his people to get their attention. And Jeremiah 18:1, it says this is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message. So I went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. So the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as seemed best to him. Then the word of the Lord came to me. He said, Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does? Declares the Lord. Like clay in the hands of the potter, so you are in my hand. It's a classic passage about God taking this approach with his people of a potter working with clay. In this kind of metaphor, the clay obviously stands for all of us, and the potter obviously stands for God. And when it comes to pottery, I have very little experience. I've done a lot of work with Play-Doh with my daughters, if that counts. But I know how frustrating it can be working with just Play-Doh. I try to create stuff, and it rarely turns out the way I intended it to be. And this text talks about the idea of a potter working on something that doesn't turn out the way it's supposed to. Do we actually have anyone in here who's worked with pottery? Maybe you've taken a class on it or something like that. Okay, so how many of you have ever worked with pottery and you did something and it didn't turn out the way you expected it to be? Okay, I think most of us have, right? We've either working with pottery or working with Play-Doh. We work and it doesn't turn out the way that we want it to. And with pottery, you can get to the point where you have just like a little touch here or there, and it's not going to help. It's not going to help that clay become what you want it to be. And when that happens, what do you have to do? You have to start over. You have to take the piece of clay and you have to start over with it. And do you know what happens to the clay when the potter decides to start over with it? He smashes it. He presses on it real hard with a lot of force. He molds it around to get it to where it's actually workable again. And then he slams it down on the potter's wheel. And those of you who work with children understand this dynamic when it comes to working with human clay. A good parent, when you think about it, always prefers to use reason with a child, right? They always prefer to use plan A with a child. Both because it's gentler and because the best option is for the child to actually willingly choose to do what's right and to do what's good rather than having it forced on them. A good parent always prefers reason. Let me ask you a question. Does an appeal to reason always work with a child? Is it always effective to say to a 3-year-old, I earnestly appeal to you, to your better nature, to stop pulling your sister's hair. This could cause physical and psychological pain and could cost money for therapy later. It does not work to reason with a 3-year-old. I have one, I know. This is why parents need things like timeout chairs and grounding privileges and tranquilizers and stuff like that. And truly loving parents know sometimes you have to go to plan B. You have to tell a child they're going to need to spend a little time on the potter's wheel. They're going to feel a little pressure and pain. And the Bible talks about this dynamic. In Hebrews 12, the writer says, My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. For what children are not disciplined by their father? You see, the discipline, this molding process, is not always pleasant, and not for the clay and not for the potter. I was reading about a radio broadcaster who was talking about parenting, and his take on it was essentially this. Parenting is essentially about lowering your standards. That's what he said. And that's kind of understandable, isn't it? Because to discipline and mold and shape a child is difficult. It's hard work. It would be easier to say, just let it slide. Just let their character slide. Just let this bad habit go unchecked. Just let this potential go unfulfilled. Just lower your standard. I think the same is true for a potter. Sometimes the potter is not gentle with the clay. I think if clay had feelings, it would complain when the potter slams it down on the pottery wheel. The clay probably doesn't want to be remolded. The clay would probably say, would you just consider lowering your standards? Would you just accept a few flaws and imperfections? You see, if the pot doesn't matter, if I'm just like making an ashtray out of like Play-Doh or something like that, it doesn't really matter if it has flaws. But if it matters, if it's going to be the work of an artist in the hands of a master craftsman, it's going to take some molding, it's going to take some shaping. And some of us in this room are on that potter's wheel right now, and it hurts. And you're tempted to pray something like this: God, could you just lower your standards? Because this time on the wheel is too painful for me. So would you just let my character go unchecked or these habits go uncorrected? Could you just lower your standards a little bit? I'm going to say more about this potter's wheel in a few moments, but right now I just want you to understand, you are in the hands of a master craftsman who loves you more than you could ever know. So trust him. Just say to him, would you mold me and would you shape me? Would you do your work in me? I trust what you're doing in me. But don't ask him to lower his standards. A great father would never do that. A great artist would never do that because the vessel matters way too much. Matters way too much. That's the lesson of the potter and the clay. Okay, now so back to Nebuchadnezzar, because he's going to go on the potter's wheel. He reaches plan A, and he's headed to the potter's wheel. He walks on the roof of his palace and he looks around. He says, this is the great Babylon, which I've built for myself and for my glory. Look at Daniel 4:31. Even as the words were on his lips, God wants to ensure that Nebuchadnezzar makes the connection between what he has just said and what he is about to experience. He wants Nebuchadnezzar to go through some real pain and humility. Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what I decree for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. And most of us have experienced now and again a time when we get humbled, and it's kind of painful, but it's a way of putting our life in perspective, who we are in perspective. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to see this at a new standard. He's going to set a new standard in this regard. A voice comes from heaven in verse 31. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with wild animals. You'll eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what happened next, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. I mean, think about this. He had the greatest palace in all of human history. He built the premier city in all of the world and hanging gardens, one of the ancient wonders of the world. He did all of this on the backs of the poor while they suffered and were enslaved and died, but he never saw them as anything but his tools. And now he's one of them. I mean, just get your arms around, your mind around that. Now he's one of them. He would not listen to God, so he ended up on the potter's wheel, and now he's homeless. And I wonder if the thought ever occurred to him, what did I ever do for the homeless when I had the opportunity to do so much for them? He used to brag about how he had PhDs from Harvard working for him, wise men at his beck and call. And now his whole world is just filled with confusion and darkness. Men whose fathers and brothers he killed for the walls and the gardens and the palaces and the battles now laugh at him or pity him. Mothers shield their children from him so they won't have bad dreams just at the very sight of him. This is his life now. He's on the potter's wheel, day after day and week after week. How long does it last? 7 times, the writer says. And we've already seen how in ancient times, in the book of Daniel in particular, 7 is used as a metaphor for a lot. But the righteous stumble 7 times. The fool says that he is wiser than 7 men that answer with discretion. Make the furnace 7 times hotter than usual, Nebuchadnezzar said. How long is 7 times? We don't know exactly. It may be 7 years. But the primary idea, I think, here is as long as it takes. How long will it take? We don't know, but the potter knows. The potter has impeccable timing. As long as it's required for Nebuchadnezzar to walk in the shoes of the weak and the poor and the uneducated and the unattractive and the unconnected and the despised, those he had never seen in his life before this, until he learns to see them, until he begins to learn something about compassion and wisdom, which for all of his supposed greatness he had very little of. Until it comes to dawn on him that all he had before, that he thought was the result of his might and his power and his glory, it was just a gift. He didn't deserve it. He didn't earn it. He could lose it in a heartbeat and would one day stand accountable to God for it. It would take as long as it took for him to learn, because he insisted on learning the hard way. He had to learn about the one qualification that God was looking for in his heart. And it was the last thing he expected. Look back at verse 17. You might not have noticed this. This is quite a remarkable statement here. Verse 17. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. The Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of earth, gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. What does that mean, the lowliest of people? Does it mean people who are low functioning or have a real low IQ? Not necessarily, although God can use anyone. I think it's precisely what Jesus talks about when he says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. It's the law of the kingdom of God. It's like this, what Dallas Willard calls the law of inversion. It's the upside-down kingdom. Greatness in the kingdom is defined by servanthood. It's what we see in the lowliest man, in the biblical sense, who ever lived, the carpenter from Nazareth, who humbled himself to the point of death. And therefore, God has exalted him above every name. And at the name of Jesus, one day, every knee is going to bow and every tongue is going to confess, including Daniel's tongue and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's tongue, and one day old Nebuchadnezzar's tongue, that the lowliest of all is in fact the Lord of all. Nebuchadnezzar is going to have to stay on the potter's wheel until he learns about life in the kingdom of God. And not just that he intellectually learns about it, but that he wants to submit himself to it. And I'll tell you what the turning point was for him. This is always the turning point for people who are actually on the potter's wheel. Verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. Now understand, when he uses this phrase, he's not just saying, I happened to glance up at the sky. This is not just about where he's directing his physical gaze. Nebuchadnezzar is saying, finally, I was so consumed with myself, never really saw anything or anyone but me, never really saw anything but my own agenda, never was really impressed with any glory but my glory. I, Nebuchadnezzar, finally looked at the one whom I have had avoided my whole life. Deep down inside, I knew I had been displeasing him all along. But I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to face him. Finally, after all this time on the wheel, as long as it took to understand the nature of the kingdom and my place in it, finally, I raised my eyes to heaven. Finally, I looked with my heart and my soul and my mind and my strength. I looked to God because I had nowhere else to look. I went to God because I had nowhere else to go. I raised my eyes to heaven, and I realized it was my last and best and only hope. And of course, that's all God was waiting for. It's such an ironic thing. When Nebuchadnezzar was on top of the world, the ruler of the planet essentially, an entire empire was built by him, God was deeply distressed by his heart and by his life. God was not impressed with Nebuchadnezzar at all. And now, despised, humbled, homeless, broken, insane, he raises his eyes toward heaven and finds a father who loves him with an irrational love and has been waiting 7 times for his son to come home. I don't know about you, but maybe you're on the potter's wheel. Maybe you messed up really bad in some area of your life. Maybe for a long time, and you've been paying a high price. Maybe you've been wrestling with the wrong attitude, with something that is blocking your heart, and now you're experiencing pain and brokenness. Maybe you've damaged another person badly, and you know it, and the consequences have been severe for you. Maybe the truth is you've been building your own kingdom. Maybe it involves your job. Maybe it involves work in the church. But the truth is you've been building your own little Babylon, and now it's like all falling apart for you. Maybe you don't even know why. Maybe you've done nothing wrong, and you're just experiencing pain because often that happens in life. I believe God wants us to know today when we hit bottom, what we need to do is look up. We need to raise our eyes toward heaven, our last and best and only hope. This is a remarkable thing to me. Nebuchadnezzar looks up, his sanity is restored, and then his immediate response is to worship God. He said, "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then, immediately, I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever." And this is a real striking thing to me. He doesn't respond to this experience, to these years, by saying, "I can't believe all these years that were wasted. I'll never recover from this humiliation and embarrassment." All this time he spent just like insane, like out of his mind. The whole era of his life that he'll never get back, it's gone. And there's no expression of regret or despair, just worship and praise and joy. Why? Because he now understands. He now can see his life very clearly. He now understands that nothing is wasted in the hands of the Father. Nothing, not one day, not one moment. And so if you've been on the potter's wheel for a while, if you're ready to submit, to raise your eyes toward heaven, to say, "All right, God, I'm in your hands," then all these years, however long it has been for you, which from the outside look like a total loss of power and influence and opportunity, they are in fact one of the greatest gifts that you received. It's not a loss at all because nothing is wasted in the hands of the potter. Our band is going to come and they're going to sing, we're going to sing to him, to the potter, in just a moment. But I just want to say one more thing before we do that. If you're here today and you're on the potter's wheel and you feel like you're alone and you feel kind of like Nebuchadnezzar did, quite isolated, I just want you to hear this. There's another striking thing about this text to me. Nebuchadnezzar, the leader who wanted everyone to know that he had built this great Babylon by his mighty power and for the glory of God, he's been disgraced, he's been dethroned, homeless, insane, and humiliated. Now, if this happened to me, I wouldn't want anyone to know about this. I would not spread this news a whole lot. But Nebuchadnezzar, not only does he not try to cover it up, he writes out his story. You know, when we do baptisms at Blue Oaks, we have each person write out their story. We want people to share their story of God's redemption. And when they do, when they write their story, do you know who they write it to? They're writing it to you. They're writing it to me. They're writing it to our church, the people that they're going to stand before and proclaim that they have a relationship with Jesus Christ too. Who does Nebuchadnezzar write his story to? If you look at the beginning of this chapter, he addresses it to nations and peoples of every language who live in all the world. It doesn't matter what people think about him anymore. He just wants them to know God. He just wants to know about life in the kingdom of God. See, he's discovered what people who enter into kingdom community always discover, what Paul writes about centuries later, which is we have this treasure of God's love, the gospel, in jars of clay. We're flawed vessels, every one of us. We are cracked pots. And the truth about us is we are all a community of cracked pots. Take a look at the person next to you for a moment. If you look closely at that person, you will see some cracks. But if you look even more closely, you'll see what God saw when he looked down from heaven at Nebuchadnezzar when he lifted his eyes up to him, which is this lump of clay that one day in the hands of the potter will fully reflect without mar or blemish the glory and the beauty of the image of God. But we must trust him. We must trust the potter. And so we're going to sing now this wonderful song about how God, the potter, makes us beautiful in his time. And I'm going to ask as we sing it that you make this statement a statement of your trust that God is going to make you beautiful in his time. All right, let's pray together. And the ushers are going to come forward to receive the offering as well. So let's pray and then we'll sing together. God, thank you so much for being our Father, for being trustworthy. Thank you that you are a potter and that you mold us and that you shape us. And we know that it's painful. We know that it hurts. But we know that you are a God who disciplines. And you discipline with love. You care about our future. You care that we submit to you and we obey you because you know that that's the best thing for us, just like we as earthly fathers know what's best for our children. And so, God, we just say we trust you. We trust what you're doing. Even though it's painful and even though it hurts, and even though sometimes we don't even know what's happening, we trust you, God. And God, I pray for some people who are on that potter's wheel right now because of something they've done, because they've maybe neglected you, or they've just shaken their fist in your face and defied you. I pray that you would help them, that you would reason with them, and that you would keep them on that wheel as long as it takes, God, to shape them and mold them into something beautiful. We trust that you're doing that, God. And we thank you for doing that. We thank you for being the potter in our lives. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.